So now that we have the hero beam pretty much good to go, we're going to set up the villain beam. And really all that needs to be done is we're going to take this, we're going to hit Control C, and then we're going to hit Control V. There's going to be some needs or things that we need to change, but we'll just go down the line. So first we can see that we had previously set up our animation, so we don't have to play with that at all. We're going to resample it, get the rest position and put a UV on it. This noises it up. Let's see, I can see that there's a bit too much amplitude on his beam in the beginning and not enough as it's shooting out, so we'll want to do a little bit more there, and then 0 here. I think we'll add a bit more as it shoots out there. Okay, so that's looking fine. Gonna smooth it a little bit, polyframe it to give us the normal along the curve, then this reverses it. Then this gives us our values along the curve so that we can create a poly wire. That's coming out of the wand pretty well. And it doesn't really need to taper at the end since all the beam is going to be shooting out down it. Here we're going to want to change this to beam villain. Then here, this is filling it with points. We're now transferring our normals to this curve. This creates a random normal per point. We go here, and then this creates our normals, which are then turned into velocity. And we can see our velocity there. It does look like I am changing the bias as this shoots out, which I think works fine. I'll add a little bit to the bias as it first shoots. And then this gives us our color along the curve. And right now I don't have anything directly set up with this color, but it's something that I can add to later by isolating whatever's green, red, or blue, and then using that to either mesh or create its own density that can illuminate the beams. There's a lot of things that we can do with it. So now let's go into the pop net. I believe he starts his beam sooner, so let's just look here. This carve. So he starts shooting at frame 44. So we need to change this pop net so that this starts at 44. Got to dive in here, and so the collision objects are all good, but in, I believe it's the flip solver, we're currently getting the centroid. Oh, this all actually transferred over. We don't need to change this at all. So now it automatically looks down the chain and finds that there is beam villain tracker. And this is in the correct dimensions, so there's really not much more that we need to do. It's using op input path, so that's all fine. I'm going to do a quick flip book and see. I'm going to look through the action cam and see how this plays. So After doing the flipbook, there's one thing I noticed that doesn't quite jive, and it's as the beam fires out, you can see these top bits here, and it's just how the beam moves down as he's shooting it. It gives us this stepping motion, and I don't like that. So I'm gonna try something and see if this solves it. Right now we're emitting from a bunch of points in the center. I'm going to turn that off for right now. But in order to do that, we're gonna have to have a relatively dense mesh here. So I'm gonna subdivide it. And we're gonna do something like that. So that's pretty dense, and the reason it needs to be dense is that we're going to be creating color, and so if it doesn't have the resolution, then we're not going to get the color that we want. So if we look at this, right now the normals are what's causing the weird lighting, so if we just do it without any lighting information, then it shows up correctly. But if you look at it like this, the reason it looks all dark is because the way that the viewport lights it is using the normals, which are pretty crazy right now. But if we're going to use a mesh instead of points, this way now we can dive back into our pop net, and then up here in the pop source we can go to interpolate source. We're going to do backwards interpolation, and we're going to match topology because the topology won't change, and therefore we can have some subframe interpolation as the beam moves downward. So hopefully that gets rid of that strange stepping. The only issue that we might run into is that since there's no core density to it, the inner part of this might not look quite the same. So let's just run another flipbook and see if it's something we can use. So as the flipbook is finished, well, most of it, we can see that that does solve the issue. You can see now as this goes down, there's subframe interpolation, so it knows between the subframes where the curve is moving, and therefore fills in the gaps and gets rid of that stepping. And it's very helpful in pop sims to be able to have this. If we go back in here, being able to do interpolate source, but the best way I've found is to use match topology. It also will allow you to do it if you match point velocity, but the best results I've had are from match topology. However, a lot of the times you can't emit particles from something that has a consistent point count. But if you can, then having match topology is great. So if we look back at this flipbook, I think that this is probably going to work. The lifespan seems a bit long, but again, it's better to have more particles than less. So I'm just going to run this out and see what happens, and we'll check back in. For you, it'll take a second. For me, it's going to take a little bit. So I'm going to first, where it says hero beam, I'm going to create villain beam particles. I also think I want more particles. So right now we're emitting 8 million. I'm going to do 10. So also we want this to start at 1044. And okay. So just in case you haven't used the file cache, I assume you have, but if you haven't, the way that it creates the file name is it looks at the file node name, and then in the geometry file where it says $OS, that's using the name of this node. So if you change the name of the node, it'll change the name of the file path that it creates. So, alright. I'm going to save to disk, and we'll check back in a little bit. Alright, I've cached everything out and made a flip book. So looking at this, definitely too large of a blast, but with the power of N age and remove points, I think we'll be okay. So yeah, I think this is looking pretty good. So let's just kind of start working down the line and see if everything is just as good as the hero beam. So we'll take a look at our N age point culling. So we can see here, if we turn this off, yep, that's bringing everything down pretty good. This is just changing our P scale. This is killing any of the orphaned points, which I think is looking pretty okay. And so here's where I'm going to split out these beams. So what I like to do to easily export something in one object and bring it to another is I bring in an object merge, and then you can just click on the null that you want and place it into there. For some reason, I think it was in Houdini 16, they changed it so that it's using relative paths. I don't want it to be relative paths, so you have to do that. And so then now I can just copy this. Also, I don't want it to be called hero beam. I want it to be villain beam. So technically, we could just do a merge like this, but we'd have to assign the shader in the object, so in SOP context, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But let's say we wanted to render this, we'd probably want it to be two beams so that comp can deal with both beams independently and treat them however they want to be treated without having to deal with one other beam being over top of it or beneath it. So that's why I'm just going to be splitting it out. So geometry, villain beam. I'm going to do the same with this here. So object merge, click and drag my null up here, get rid of export relative path. Before I do that, let me paste my, whoop, we'll do that. Go back in here, cut this. Hero beam. Paste this. And now we can see them clashing, which looks pretty cool. And so this has a this has a shader here, so we want to cut this, put that here, and then in the materials we're going to take this villain beam, and assign that here. Alright, and then now we'll go into our out. And then in objects, we're just going to make sure that we are rendering the hero and villain beams. And before I hit render to just see how this is looking, I'm going to go into here. And we don't want the villain beam to look exactly the same, so we're going to create new colors. So I'm going to kick it into manual mode. And I don't know, villain colors, I feel like villain stuff is generally purplish, at least in my head. So we'll start building this out. Maybe make a hot pink type thing near the core. We got fuchsia. Want a bit more saturation on that. Okay, I think that looks interesting for now. So, now, this is a pretty interesting frame to look at, so we're going to go into our render view, and we're going to hit render. Okay, I think that's looking pretty interesting. All right.